The Dodge Pickup of 1938 stands today as one of the most charismatic icons of pre-war American automotive design, a rugged machine forged in an era when trucks were expected to survive rough rural roads, demanding farm work, primitive highways, and the growing industrial pace of the United States. It remains a symbol of a time when engineering was mechanical purity, metal against metal, simplicity over sophistication, and durability valued more than comfort. Yet, despite all the nostalgia and admiration that surround this old truck, owners, collectors, and restorers know that no classic vehicle is perfect. And the 1938 Dodge Pickup, as robust and admired as it is, carried a handful of flaws that became well known with time. Some of these issues were tied to the technological limitations of the era, while others came from design choices that, although practical in 1938, became problematic with decades of wear. Understanding these defects is essential for anyone restoring one today, appreciating its engineering, or simply exploring the true story behind a truck that helped build farms, towns, and small businesses across America. The first major defect often associated with the 1938 Dodge Pickup involved the cooling system, which struggled under heavy workloads, long climbs, or hot summer temperatures that pushed early engines to their limits. Trucks of this era were not equipped with high-efficiency radiators or advanced coolant flow designs. Instead, they relied on basic, mechanically driven pumps and radiators made from materials prone to clogging, corrosion, and sediment buildup over time. When new, the system worked adequately for the relatively low speeds and short trips common in the 1930s. However, even back then, drivers noticed that extended hauling at full load or long drives on hotter days sometimes caused the temperature gauge to climb uncomfortably. The cast-iron flathead engine, although reliable, generated substantial heat, and the airflow provided by the old-style grill and small fan was not always sufficient. As the years passed, rust in the water jackets, mineral deposits inside the radiator, and aging hoses only worsened the issue. Many owners learned to stop on the side of the road to let the engine cool, especially when driving up long inclines or carrying heavy loads. Today, restorers often install modern radiators or auxiliary cooling components, not to improve performance but simply to ensure dependable operation. This persistent overheating tendency became one of the Dodge Pickup's most discussed defects, not because it ruined the truck's reputation, but because it reminded drivers that even rugged machines had limits in an era before modern cooling technology. Another widely recognized flaw of the 1938 Dodge Pickup involves its braking system, which relied on early hydraulic drum brakes that lacked both the power and consistency modern drivers expect. While Dodge had adopted hydraulic brakes earlier than some competitors, the 1938 system still required frequent adjustment and maintenance. The drums were prone to glazing, the shoes wore unevenly, and the brake fluid lines could develop leaks after years of vibration and exposure to temperature changes. More critically, braking performance dropped dramatically in wet conditions. Drum brakes, especially those from the pre-war era, had a well-known tendency to absorb water, resulting in weak or delayed stopping power. For farmers driving on muddy terrain, or for anyone facing rain-soaked rural roads, this defect became obvious quickly. Drivers learned to compensate by anticipating stops far in advance and downshifting aggressively, using engine braking to slow the truck whenever possible. Brake fade on long downhill descents was another concern, caused by heat buildup within the drums. Even when everything was properly adjusted, the system simply lacked the stopping confidence necessary for emergency situations. Today, modern restorations sometimes include upgrades such as improved drum materials or even disc brake conversions, which dramatically enhance performance. Back in 1938, however, the braking limitations were simply part of the driving experience, accepted by owners as an unavoidable challenge. The third defect associated with the 1938 Dodge Pickup concerns the transmission and clutch assembly, which although sturdy, suffered from stiff shifting, rapid wear under heavy use, and difficulty engaging gears, particularly first and reverse. Early manual transmissions relied on non-synchronized gears, meaning drivers were required to double-clutch to match engine and shaft speeds before shifting. Skilled drivers could do this smoothly, but for many owners, especially farmers or workers unaccustomed to careful shifting, grinding gears became a daily occurrence. Over time, this wear led to noisy operation, increased vibration, and a tendency for the transmission to pop out of gear under load. The clutch, often a simple single-plate design, required significant pedal force and tended to wear more quickly when towing or hauling heavy cargo. Replacing clutch plates or adjusting linkages became part of regular maintenance. Even when properly set, the engagement could feel abrupt, making smooth starts difficult. In cold weather, the thick gear oil used at the time became even more viscous, making shifts nearly impossible until the drivetrain warmed up. All of this made driving the 1938 Dodge Pickup a physically demanding experience. For collectors today, the transmission's mechanical character is charming, but for the original owners who depended on the truck for daily labor, it was simply another challenge that accompanied their hardworking vehicle. Another commonly cited defect of the 1938 Dodge Pickup was the susceptibility of its electrical system to failure, particularly in the ignition and wiring components. Vehicles of this era used 6-volt electrical systems instead of the more stable and powerful 12-volt systems adopted in later decades. 6-volt systems struggle with voltage drop, meaning long wiring runs, corroded connections, or worn battery terminals could easily lead to hard starting, weak lighting, or intermittent ignition problems. The cloth-wrapped wires used in 1938 were prone to fraying over time, leaving exposed conductors vulnerable to moisture, short circuits, or complete failure. The ignition coil and condenser, essential components for producing a strong spark, often deteriorated quickly under vibration or heat. Many owners experienced difficulty starting the truck on cold mornings, particularly after the battery had weakened. Headlights, powered by the limited 6-volt supply, dimmed significantly at idle, making nighttime driving risky. Even when new, the electrical system demanded frequent attention, and as the truck aged, these problems only became more pronounced. Collectors restoring the 1938 Dodge Pickup often choose to keep the original 6-volt system for historical accuracy, but many convert to 12 volts to ensure reliability. To owners in the 1930s, electrical flaws were simply accepted as part of vehicle ownership, but today they stand out as one of the truck's most troublesome aspects. The fifth major defect associated with the 1938 Dodge Pickup centers on the durability and comfort of its suspension system. The truck used leaf springs at both the front and rear, a common design of the time, but one that provided a harsh and sometimes unpredictable ride. Leaf springs, especially the multi-leaf packs used on work trucks, were designed primarily for carrying heavy loads, not providing a smooth ride. When the truck was unloaded, a frequent scenario in daily driving, the suspension felt stiff and transmitted every bump directly into the cabin. On rough rural roads, common in the 1930s, this harshness became fatiguing. The shock absorbers, which were early hydraulic lever-arm designs, had limited damping capability and often wore out quickly, leaving the vehicle bouncing excessively after hitting dips or potholes. When carrying heavy loads, the suspension performed better, but the steering became heavier and more difficult to control on uneven surfaces. Over time, leaf springs sagged, cracked, or lost tension, leading to uneven ride height or misaligned axles. Even when new, the 1938 Dodge Pickup was not known for comfort. It was built for work, not for refinement. Buyers accepted this because trucks of that era were not expected to behave like cars. However, in hindsight, the suspension's limitations stand out as one of the truck's notable flaws. Modern restorers often replace worn components or even upgrade the shock absorbers to improve the driving experience, yet the original suspension design still defines how the truck feels on the road: raw, rugged, and undeniably old school. All these defects, overheating, weak brakes, stiff transmission and clutch, unreliable electrical components, and harsh suspension, did not diminish the cultural importance of the 1938 Dodge Pickup, nor its role in shaping American transportation history. Instead, they help paint a more honest and complete picture of what early trucks were truly like. They were machines built for durability but constrained by the technology of their time. They required skill, patience, and constant attention from drivers who depended on them for daily survival. The defects that seem troublesome today were merely part of life in the late 1930s, when owners repaired their own trucks, learned their quirks, and formed personal bonds with vehicles that demanded respect. For collectors, historians, and enthusiasts today, Understanding these imperfections deepens the appreciation for the engineering achievements of the era and the human stories behind every mile traveled by the 1938 Dodge Pickup. Beyond the mechanical limitations and known defects that affected the 1938 Dodge Pickup during its era, a deeper understanding reveals how these issues shaped the daily experience of the people who owned and relied on this truck. Each flaw, rather than existing in isolation, created a kind of personality for the vehicle, one that required patience, mechanical awareness, and resilience from the driver. For many who lived during the 1930s, especially in rural America, these challenges were simply woven into the fabric of life. Trucks were tools, not luxuries. They were expected to work through adversity, and owners were accustomed to fixing them on the side of the road, in barns, or in their own yards. This relationship between human and machine was far more intimate than what modern drivers experience, and the Dodge Pickup's defects became part of the story of a nation learning to adapt and innovate during an era of economic hardship and mechanical evolution. One element closely connected to all the major defects was the manufacturing context in which the 1938 Dodge Pickup was produced. America was emerging from the Great Depression, and automakers were rebuilding their place in the national economy. Materials were chosen not only for performance but also for availability and cost efficiency. Steel quality varied, casting techniques were simpler, and precision machining was far from the exact standards achievable today. This meant that components like cooling passages in engine blocks, brake cylinder bores, and gear teeth in transmissions were often inconsistent from truck to truck. Some owners experienced fewer issues simply because their components happened to be cast more cleanly or assembled with slightly better alignment. Others encountered chronic problems early on. Variability in manufacturing contributed greatly to the perception of certain defects. Even though Dodge was regarded as one of the more durable truck makers of the era, the technology available limited what could be accomplished in terms of long-term reliability. Another factor amplifying the known defects was the way these trucks were used. The typical 1938 Dodge Pickup was not a leisure vehicle or a collector's item, it was a workhorse. Many owners pushed the truck far beyond the limits modern drivers would consider reasonable. Farmers used the truck daily for hauling livestock feed, lumber, seeds, and tools, often over unpaved, deeply rutted roads. Small businesses loaded the truck to its maximum capacity, then exceeded it whenever necessary. Construction workers drove them across job sites filled with debris. This extreme usage placed enormous stress on components already limited by the engineering of the time. The cooling system overheated more readily when pulling heavy loads uphill. The brake system wore down faster when the truck was used for frequent stop-and-go labor in towns. The transmission suffered when inexperienced drivers were hired seasonally and could not master the technique of double clutching. The suspension was constantly assaulted by rough terrain, and the electrical system risked exposure to moisture, dust, and vibration that weakened its already fragile components. In a sense, the Dodge Pickup of 1938 was punished by the very people who depended on it, not out of neglect but necessity. The ownership culture of the time also influenced how defects were perceived. In 1938, there was no expectation that a vehicle would be easy to drive, maintenance-free, or comfortable. Modern drivers, accustomed to power-assisted controls, electronic stability systems, climate control, and seamless transmissions, would likely find the Dodge Pickup punishing to operate. But for drivers of the late 1930s, every truck required effort. Every gear needed persuasion, every brake pedal required planning, and every trip was a negotiation between the driver's skill and the machine's temperament. The stiff suspension, for example, while considered a defect today, was simply accepted as the normal feel of a truck. People expected the ride to be rough. They expected to bounce in their seats and feel every contour of the road. When the suspension wore out prematurely or springs cracked under strain, owners saw it not as a sign of poor design, but as a consequence of hard work. The same was true of the brake system, where drivers simply learned to anticipate traffic earlier. Rather than condemning the design, they internalized driving techniques that compensated for its shortcomings. The electrical system, despite its flaws, presented a unique kind of challenge. Many owners kept spare parts, coils, condensers, bulbs, and even wiring sections, stored in toolboxes or glove compartments. A weak battery on a cold morning was not a frustration but a routine problem that people solved with hand-crank chargers, push starts, or rolling downhill. Farmers joked that if the Dodge pickup started on the first try, it was a blessing. If it didn't, it was business as usual. The 6-volt system was inherently limited in power output, and yet it persisted well into the late 1940s across the industry. It was only in hindsight, with the adoption of 12-volt systems, that the shortcomings of the earlier electrical design became glaringly obvious. In 1938, drivers didn't think of it as a defect, they thought of it as technology doing its best with what was available. One overlooked aspect of the Dodge Pickup's defects involves the cabin and driver ergonomics. Although not typically listed as a mechanical flaw, the driving experience was undeniably influenced by poor ergonomics. Seats were stiff, minimally padded, and offered no adjustability. Long drives resulted in back pain, leg cramps, and fatigue. The steering wheel was large to compensate for the lack of power steering, and it demanded significant strength to maneuver at slow speeds or when the truck was fully loaded. The pedal layout differed from modern standards, with a heavy clutch, a brake pedal that required considerable force, and a throttle that could feel twitchy depending on engine temperature and carburetor tuning. Combined with vibration from the drivetrain and noise from the uninsulated cabin, driving the Dodge pickup could be physically taxing. While these aspects were not considered defects in the traditional sense, they contributed significantly to the feeling that the vehicle was demanding and at times unforgiving. Nevertheless, owners accepted these conditions because comfort simply wasn't a priority in truck design during the 1930s. Interestingly, the very defects that challenged owners in 1938 have contributed to the appreciation collectors feel today. The imperfections make the truck more authentic, more connected to an era in which machines were honest, mechanical, and designed for simple function rather than convenience. Restorers often embrace the original quirks, keeping the 6-volt electrical system, the manual drum brakes, and the unsynchronized transmission to preserve the true character of the vehicle. Others choose to modernize these components for safety and reliability, installing electric fuel pumps, aluminum radiators, 12-volt conversions, and improved suspension components. Both approaches acknowledge the defects but interpret them through different lenses, one valuing authenticity, the other practicality. The fact that the truck can be appreciated today in either form shows its enduring versatility and appeal. The defects also highlight the remarkable durability of the Dodge Pickup's core engineering. Despite overheating issues, many engines lasted decades with regular care. Despite weak brakes, many trucks survived demanding work environments without catastrophic failure. Despite stiff transmissions, they continued to function year after year, even when abused. Despite electrical problems, they started eventually, sometimes with effort, sometimes with creativity, but reliably enough for their owners to trust them. Despite the harsh suspension, they handled loads that challenged even larger vehicles. These contradictions are part of what make the 1938 Dodge pickup so compelling. It was imperfect, but it was dependable. It was difficult to drive, but it was loyal. It broke down, but it could always be fixed. Its defects were real, but so was its resilience. Another important dimension to understanding these flaws is recognizing the vast difference between the expectations of 1938 and the expectations of modern collectors. When the Dodge pickup was new, longevity beyond 10 or 15 years was not expected. Vehicles were not engineered for half a century of service. The fact that many examples still exist today is a testament to both the truck's inherent durability and the dedication of the owners who kept them alive. Components that wore out quickly were considered expendable items, meant to be replaced regularly. Radiators were rawed out, brake systems were rebuilt, clutches were replaced, wiring was redone by hand. Trucks were living machines requiring continuous renewal. That mindset shaped the way defects were interpreted. What seems like a major flaw today was often seen as an ordinary maintenance requirement in 1938. Even the way roads were built in the 1930s influenced which defects mattered most. Poor roads with loose gravel, mud, and potholes placed enormous strain on suspensions, steering systems, and brakes. The Dodge Pickup's harsh ride, weak braking, and heavy steering were not so much failures of design as symptoms of the environment in which the truck operated. Modern roads mask many of these issues in restored trucks, making them feel more capable today than they might have felt when new. It is ironic that the defects which once caused frustration now add charm. They remind drivers of the era's rough conditions and the ruggedness required to overcome them. Ultimately, the 5 major defects of the 1938 Dodge Pickup, cooling weaknesses, braking limitations, transmission and clutch challenges, electrical vulnerabilities, and rough suspension, form part of a larger narrative about early American automotive development. These issues did not define the truck as a failure. Instead, they defined it as a product of its time, shaped by the needs, constraints, and realities of a nation in transition. The truck was not perfect, but perfection was never the goal. It was built to work, to endure, and to serve the people who depended on it. Its defects were simply part of that journey. They gave the truck a personality as rugged as the landscapes it crossed and as stubbornly persistent as the workers who drove it. For today's collectors, historians, and enthusiasts, understanding these flaws deepens the connection to the vehicle. It reveals the human side of engineering, where every machine carries the imprint of its era's limitations and aspirations. The 1938 Dodge Pickup remains a beloved classic not despite its defects, but in many ways because of them. They remind us that history is lived through imperfection and that the soul of an old truck lies not only in its strengths but also in the challenges that shaped its story across generations.